All of my work on the in the environmental field, all of it basically comes from my identity with the water. And I have, like I said, I'm a fourth generation fisherwoman, and I've spent my entire life on the bay. And when I was very young, I would go shrimping with my dad, and I can remember I was probably 5 years old, and I can remember coming to the bay, and the bay, it was a woman, and it was, I could see her, I could feel her personality, and she was like a grandmother, and she had this long gray hair, she had this long dress that kind of flowed out into the water. And when I was a kid, she was real, and she had this personality of this old wise woman. And so and she really loved me. And when you're one of 7 kids, and women aren't considered too valuable in this part of the country, so to come to the bay was like coming home. And I mean, she was always welcoming. She was like, well, hello, Diane. It's like, it's so good you're down here at the bay. And so the bay was a person, and it was, and I guess, you could get a psychiatrist, and he would say it was a little bit of a mystical thing, and it was being on the water was you were a part of it. Matter of fact, I used to feel like my skin would, my molecules would separate, and the water would move into them, and so there was no division. And so I know my environmental lawyer used to call it a sense of place, and I never knew what that word was until, or that phrase was, until he said, Wilson, you got a sense of place. And I guess I do. And it's also, I'm sure, with the Native Americans, when they talk about a mountain, or when they talk about a stream or the trees, when they say they have spirits. It's like they're not fooling. I mean, it's real. And when I was little, I saw it, and I never forgot it. When I was young, we always went shrimping on the day before norther would blow in, because when you're a fisherman, you know when the shrimp will come out of the mud. You know when they will start coming together and they will bunch up in parts of the bay. And if you're real versed on shrimping, you know where you can catch them. So the weather plays a big part to how it affects the water and whether the tide, because when you go out in the morning, you notice the level of the tide, especially notice the moon, what phase of the moon, and because you got an idea about shrimp are going to be moving out. And when I was young, I always went out, and when we would spend the night out on right before a norther would come. And so you'd be out there on the bay, on that old creek and boat, and I always slept on top of the cabin of the boat, and you would have this norther, just this fresh norther, just come blow it in, and the whole boat would rock. And sometimes I would have a quilt, and the wind would be blowing so hard it would take my quilt and just pitch it out in the middle of the bay. But I think my favorite time was when the water was rough. I remember one time I was shrimping, and my net got caught in the block of the ropes got caught. So I had to scale the mast pole with a knife in my teeth and get right to the top. And that mast was just, I mean, the whole boat was rocking, and you could just see all of that water, and it was this gray water, and it was just wild in the rain. And I have never felt that free in my life. And it just conveys its power and its feeling of freedom. And but I would have these women that would a couple of women that would go out with me, and they'd see a little black cloud forming in the west. You know, you could tell when a little squall was coming up, and they'd say, "Well, Diane, don't you think we need to head in now? I think we need to head in now." And I was like, oh no, this is gonna get, and it's wonderful. I love it when a squall breaks in, or I love it when I've been out there when tornadoes were forming. They were just popping all over, you know, and the sky gets totally green, and you start seeing these water spouts, and it's exhilarating. It's got to be energy. It's just this energy in the water and the wind and that boat. And I mean, it's just this commingling of all this energy, and you've never felt so much alive as when you're there. I guess I first started my activism when shrimping was so bad. I wasn't even shrimping. I had tied up the boat, and I was running a fish house up for my brother. And I had all these shrimpers, and they'd bring their shrimp boats in, and I'd get their catch, and I'd deal with the Cajun truck drivers. And I had this one shrimper, and he had 3 different types of cancers. They were like tennis balls. They were the huge lumps all over his arm. And he was a real young fella, and he brought me a article, and it was Associated Press story, and it mentioned Calhoun County, which is the county I'm from. It mentioned us about 4 or 5 times, and it was the toxic release inventory. It was the first time the toxic release inventory, which is where industry has to report their emissions to the air, to the water, to the land, to injection wells. It was the first time they ever reported them. It was the first time it was ever made public, and it was the first time it was ever in print. And to find out you're number 1, it was like, and I was so just absolutely horrified with that data. So I just called the meeting. I went down to City Hall and said, you know, we had this little room outside City Hall, and sometimes they had little games there, and sometimes they had a little dance there for the kids there. So I called the meeting, and there was such a backlash from that one simple meeting. To be honest, it caught my curiosity because I could not figure out what was going on, because suddenly I had City Hall, I had the county commissioners, I had the mayors, I had the plant managers coming down and telling me to be a good citizen and not do this. And I was like, do what? What am I doing? It was like I was calling a meeting, and they would say, well, we're having economic development down here, and this is just red flags, red flags. This looks like trouble. And I even had the bank president come down to the fish house. I had never spoken to that man a day in my life. And he was down there, and he said I was getting a vigilante group. And I'm like, I'm not doing nothing but calling a meeting. And it was, and suddenly all of the at that time it was like Phil Graham and Lofton, he was a representative at that time, and all of these senators and representatives, suddenly they were on TV and saying, you know, we just can't have this questioning of industry. And I had no idea what they were talking about. Phil Graham, who was the congressman at that time and had a war chest for the time when he can be run for president, he was getting all of the praise for bringing this huge multinational down. His former campaign manager at that time, Bill Layton, at that time was the head of the EPA Regional 6 in Dallas. And the permits had been guaranteed. They had been also not only guaranteed, but they were to be moved in record time, in like 3 to 6 months. They were going to have the water permits, their air permits out. And this was a plant that was already ready to bring in the workers to start expansion. They had the contracts in line, and they were ready to go. And a little bit known to anybody else was that not only did I just unexpectedly say, well, I want a permit hearing on this. Not only that, but I found out later is that this was an outlaw polluter in Taiwan. In Taiwan, it's one of the fastest economically rising places in the world. But the only thing keeping abreast was its economic raising, was its environmental destruction. And I mean, the island is devastated by its environmental destruction. And they were so bad in Taiwan that when Chairman Wong wanted to build this plant over in Taiwan, they had the farmers, the villagers, throw stones at him and refuse to allow him to build it. And so what did we do? We brought him to Texas. I mean, totally kicked out. And so he brings his whole reputation, his way of doing business, and he brings it down here to the state of Texas. And not only does the Department of Commerce, the Chamber of Commerce, do they not even ask him one thing about his environmental record? You know, it's like, you know, how do you do business? What's your philosophy on environmental protection? They gave this company $250 million in tax abatements. I mean, we got a little small school district. I mean, and it was so poor that they were fixing to eliminate 17 teachers, and our school district was given $100 million in tax abatements. And so here was this set deal, this environmental polluter, this known environmental polluter. No questions were being asked. They were giving him the whole store. They were giving him the whole county. They were, matter of fact, we got a Mercury Underwater Superfund site. They were going to be trenching the Mercury underwater so they could get these bigger fleets of ships through to load up the PVC and just go all over the world with it. And I asked for a hearing on them. And it's like the whole world caved in on me. And it was like I said, I not only had the plant managers, I had Chamber of Commerce, Economic Development, I had senators, I had county commissioners, and they were all telling me that I wasn't being a good citizen, that I was hysterical, that I didn't know what I was doing because I was just a woman, I was just a fisherman. And matter of fact, at one point I had tried, I have tried in the beginning to do things the right way. I in my environmental group, I got a vice president, and I got some directors, and I got a secretary and a treasurer, and then the company threatened to sue me, and every single one of my directors quit. My secretary and treasurers, everybody quit. So I found out that one, I was going to be doing it alone. I only had the lady who worked with me in the fish house who would get behind me and say, "Okay, Diane, you're doing good." And she would, I couldn't get anybody to stand up with me, so I would go to permit hearings all by myself. If I would do a demonstration, I was all by myself. And the only people I could get was out of state. I mean, either out of state, an activist out of Louisiana, or I could get an environmental group in Houston to come down and if I was going to have a press release, because that's the only way I could have anybody. Otherwise, I would be by myself. And so here you are, you're fighting a permit application, and I was fighting. In the beginning, I was just fighting that here was the biggest thing Texas had ever had. I mean, the biggest thing we'd ever had. It was PVC, polyvinyl chloride. We're talking vinyl chloride. We're talking ethylene dichloride. And there is known links with vinyl chloride to cancer of the liver. I mean, there are known. And this is a polluter. He's notorious. And there was not going to be the first study on what this plant was going to impact us. I mean, he's there on Lavaca Bay. They're going to discharge 15 million gallons a day of vinyl chloride, EDC, chlorine, all these heavy metals, copper, you name it. And right across the causeway is a Superfund site, a mercury contaminated Superfund site. And they have chemicals, formaldehyde chemicals in its discharge that would react with the mercury and make an even more deadly toxin to the seafood around there. But there was no questions. There wasn't going to be any kind of study. And so I went through all the processes. I did a petition. I gathered names. I filed permit applications. I filed lawsuits because for not doing an environmental impact statement, they were absolutely violating federal law. I mean, there are no two ways about it. They were violating it. And so I had lawsuits, I had petitions, I had permit hearings. And I remember the first time, even with all that information and what a polluter they were, the information was out on what a polluter they were, is that the information had been leaked out of the EPA, and it was headlines in the Houston Chronicle that Formosa was not going to have to do a study. It was a done deal. It was like, and so I remember the activists in Houston that would come to press releases with me, and he said, "Well, it's over with Diane." He said, "There's nothing else you can do." He said, "You fought a good fight, and let it go." He said, "It's a done deal. They're going to do it." And I'm like, "No, they're not going to get it." And it's like, and he kept saying, well, there's nothing else you can do. It's like the parade is over with. You've done a good job. Nobody is going to say anything about you quitting. And I was like, it's like the Bay was personal with me. It was a part of who I was. And I knew there was no doubt that this company was going to come in and they were going to create another death to that bay. They were going to create another blow, and they were going to kill it. And I had no doubt that they had every indication of it. Their whole history was of it. and with the fact that the EPA and the state wasn't even going to question it, it was like they weren't going to stop them on anything. And I said, nope, they're not going to do it. And off the top of my head, I said, I'll do a hunger strike. And I still remember that it was Rick Abraham. He looked at me and he said, Diane, you can't do a hunger strike. And I said, oh yeah, I can do a hunger strike. And he said, women don't do hunger strikes. And he said, especially women in Texas don't do hunger strikes. He said, in California they do hunger strikes. They don't do them in Texas. And I said, yeah, I'm going to do a hunger strike. And I didn't know the first thing about a hunger strike. Didn't know the first thing, didn't know how to do them. I just know you just didn't eat food. But once I said it, I knew enough about human nature that if I didn't act on that impulse, if I slept on it, I'd wake up the next morning and say, oh, thank God I didn't do the hunger strike. Because, I mean, you is going to look real stupid, a woman going out there and saying she's doing a hunger strike. And so I immediately got a phone, called the Victoria Advocate reporter and said, I'm starting a hunger strike for an EIS on Formosa. And she said, when? And I said, right now. I'm starting it right now. And so I found me a shrimp boat in Lavaca Bay, and I started my hunger strike right there on that boat. And like I said, I had never did it before. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to organize it. And matter of fact, I did everything wrong that I could have possibly done wrong. I didn't even have a phone. So I was on the boat with no phone. It was like nobody even for the first week, people didn't even know outside of the county. They didn't even know I was on a hunger strike. And the only ones who knew it was Formosa. And they would send their men in their business suits. And it was like they would show me off. They would bring down their corporate little engineers, and then they'd come on the boat and they'd say, well, this is Diane. Don't she look stupid? They would say, you look real stupid, Diane. They would just tell me, you don't know. They said, well, you're shooting yourself in the foot on this one. You just look people in town think you look real stupid. And I just kept saying, I'm doing a hunger strike. And eventually, within a week had passed, and matter of fact, the shrimper that owned the boat, he didn't know I was on his shrimp boat. That shows you how unorganized I had been. He saw when a camera crew came from Houston, and he looked on the news that night, and he saw a woman on his shrimp boat on the news. So he came down to Port Lavaca, where I was stationed at, and he said, if you don't get off this boat by tomorrow, he said, I'm going to pitch you off. And I'm like, I'm a shrimper like you are, I'm just trying to help the bays. And he said, you ain't a shrimper, you're an environmentalist. And he was going to pitch me off that boat. So I just decided, so I got up off the boat, and I had the lady that was she would bring me water down to the boat. And so I said, just take me down to the park. And there was a park right beside Formosa. And I said, I just need a little airing out. And I didn't tell her I was been kicked off the boat, and I had to move it. And so she took me down to the park, and after she left, I made sure she left, and I just walked around and went right around the park and sit down on Formosa's front lawn and just sit there. And you want to talk about people getting haywire. And suddenly, everybody was coming out of the office because I was sitting there right in broad daylight, right in front of the sign, just leaning up against a tree. And pretty soon, here come security, and here would come some regulatory affairs, and they're like, Diane, won't you come inside? Let's sit inside where it's cooler. I was like, no, I just feel real good right here. And by doing that, and then calling the EPA and telling them I was going to take the hunger strike to their doorstep, they changed in 2 weeks of a hunger strike. I got exactly what I wanted, and we got the EIS. And because they had to do the EIS in Texas, Formosa was trying to build a rayon plant in Louisiana. Because they had to do one in Texas with their Formosa plant, they had to do the one in Louisiana. And it's killed the one in Louisiana. So they never did get to build a rayon plant. but it stalled the plant operation about 2 years. And so that's where it started moving. And like I said, when you have the mayors, when you have the commissioners, when you have senators, when you have justice of the peace, when every elected official that is supposed to represent you has tie-ins with the the chemical industries, where they have contracts, they have security contracts, they have construction contracts. It's a total tie-in, and nobody wants to stop them. If there's kickbacks, nobody wants to prosecute them. If they have spills, nobody wants to prosecute them because they want a computer system. And I know I went down to Corpus Christi, and 2 inspectors went to their files when they found out I was dealing with. They went to their files, pulled files out, and gave them to me and said, "We can't get anything done. It goes up onto this bottleneck and it just stops." And he said, "You do something with it." And so that shows you where the environmental agencies are for the state, for the EPA. There is too much political pressure. There is too much of a total networking and bonding, and like the one of the directors at the Water Commission at that time, was Water Commission down there. He had his application in. Soon as he got out of there, in about a year, he had his application in for Formosa Plastics. It's known among environmentalists. They call it the swinging door. It's like they're just waiting so they can get out and make more money with industry. So you don't have the political will with these agencies, and the other is like you just don't have the funding, and you don't have environmental enforcement. You don't have these inspections. And the irony of it is, like, every time I've had a big environmental meeting, and I would get these people in the back, and they said, "You don't know nothing about this, and leave this to the agencies. It's their business." And it's like, you have just got no idea about what's really going on. My boat was sabotaged twice. I had the helicopter landed in my front yard, shot at my mother-in-law, killed the dog, shot at the house, and in the sheriff's department, it's like they couldn't care less. Sheriff's department wants a computer system. The ambulance, you try to get how many workers are being hurt. The ambulance is getting defibrillators. The churches are getting all kinds of stuff. The libraries are getting on computers. And so you can always tell when there is a dilemma with the industry, because suddenly you can ask for anything. Anybody in the county can ask for anything, and they'll get it. Because you want to, it's like, we're giving to the community. We're giving to the community. And but they are very definitely, they try, when you start making a inroad, they start trying to intimidate you, and especially when you're your people are afraid to do it. They can't even get loans at the bank because these people are sitting as directors of the banks, and so they don't speak out. Their husband works at the plant. They'll lose a job. Their cousin works at the plant, And it's everybody, especially in a small town like that, like everybody's connected. And so they become very frightened and intimidated. Privately, they think you're doing a good job. But, I've had anonymous phone calls telling me, "You're doing good, you're doing good. Somebody's got to do this, but I can't." I had this appeal in Washington, and I had stopped their permit. They could not move until a Washington federal judge decided whether they could have a discharge. And so one day I was on the phone talking with the EPA lawyer, and my name is Diane, and Formosa's lawyer's name is Diane. And so she thought I was Formosa's lawyer. And so she was just discussing about their wastewater discharge and how it was doing and how many gallons. And I was like, "What?" It's like, you're not supposed to be discharging. You know, I got it blocked. And here they were discharging. The state knew it, the EPA knew it, Formosa knew it. It just, the public didn't know it. And it's like, and so the reality is whatever they're going to do, they are going to do. It does not matter how many laws they break. That's just the reality. That's what it boils down to. And it was like, I could not stand to just let it go like this. And you have to do something to grab people and say, this is not right. It's like people get so used to compromise that they're finally so compromised they don't even have an arm anymore, and they look down like, I got a whole complete arm, and their whole arm is gone. And so I was like, and so it just off the top of my head, it's I knew I was going to sink something, and I knew it had to be my own boat because, one, while I do civil disobedience, it always, I don't do damage to anybody else. I bring it, it's a personal thing. And so I felt I had to sacrifice my boat. And the reality is, it is a truth. That boat is nowhere is as valuable as that bay. And it's like, well, how has it got where we think a boat is more valuable than a bay? It's not. And so, in reality, I really wasn't doing that much. But in the way life is twisted, it's like, oh, your boat is like a farm. It's like, I mean, how can you do something like that? So I took the motor out of my boat, because if I had spilled the diesel and if I had spilled oil in the bay, everybody would have looked at the oil and said, oh, look at that polluter. And they wouldn't have said anything about Formosa putting 7 million gallons a day of wastewater out there illegally. That wouldn't have been an issue. It would have been me. So I took the engine out because I intended to sink the boat, and I got a shrimper to pull me out in the dead of night, and I was going all the way to Lavaca Bay, and I was going to get Formosa's discharge, and I was going to sink it right on top of that discharge. And it was like, it was going to go down, and the only thing was going to be sticking up is the mast pole. It was going to be a monument to Formosa's wrong and evil deed of destruction, what they were doing to that bay. And it was just going to be a monument. And except that the Coast Guard got wind of it, so I had 3 boatloads of Coast Guard, and they said I was a terrorist on the high seas, and 15 years in the federal pen, and $500,000 in penalties, and they said if any shrimper dared tow me out there any further, because I was almost there. I was probably like half a mile away from the discharge point, and that they would confiscate their boat too. And so the Coast Guard confiscated the boat. As a matter of fact, I spent the night on the boat tied up, and the Coast Guard spent the night. There was 3 truckloads of them in trucks, because they were afraid somehow or another I was going to get that boat. It's still, I don't know, maybe they thought I was going to fly it out there. But they stayed around because they was afraid I was going to somehow get that boat out there. But the shrimpers, who normally haven't been supporting me because they, you know, they just quit believing. They just quit believing you can make a difference. They were so taken by what I was doing. They all got in their shrimp boats, the Vietnamese and the Anglos and the Hispanics, and it was a huge norther that had came in, so it was a really rough time out in the bay. And on Lavaca Bay, when it's really rough, you can sink a tanker. It can get so rough. So it was very dangerous, but they all took their boats, and they did this blockade and this protest. And it was after that Formosa said, it was like, what is it going to take to shut her up? And so that's why I got 0 discharge. The end results of my attempt to sink that shrimp boat was that Formosa sat down with me, and I brought in a environmental engineer, Jack Matson from Penn State, and it's very critical to have a person on the activist side who understands the concept of zero discharge, because even while you get companies to talk about it, their mindset the whole time they're discussing this with you is to go back exactly what they were doing. So your dilemma is to convince them and keep showing them how they can do it. And because we always put in the agreements I made, and probably why they agreed to them, is not only environmentally superior, but economically feasible. We had to show by sound science that it was environmentally superior and economically feasible. And you can do it. Matter of fact, Jack Matson, who teaches environmental excellence at Penn State and did many zero discharge uh, pulling processes in a lot of plants, is that any chemical plant can go zero discharge. It's like a chemical plant takes perhaps 2% of its capital budget to do the wastewater, and for like 2% more, you can go totally zero discharge. And it's like each chemical company has to be customized. You know, like one thing may work for one chemical plant that doesn't work for another, but it can be done for every chemical plant. And with Formosa Plastics, the first agreement we got 33% of their waste stream recycled. We saved 2.6 million gallons of fresh water a day. I have got most of my help from the workers, and I've become a strong ally. I will always speak up for for the worker. And matter of fact, I was probably the only, when I did a hunger strike and got an agreement with Formosa, and the unions went berserk because it was the first time an environmental agreement had provisions for the workers in it. And and I just thought it as a matter of fact. It was like, I mean, anybody that leaves out the equation of the workers, you're missing it, because they are the allies, and they're just people, and people are just the environmental movement, I think, is reluctant to go that way. Whether they're intimidated by them, and a lot of times the industry uses that possible antagonizement, because I remember one time I did a demonstration against Formosa Plastics, and I had my kids there. I had a couple old ladies. I had a couple old deckhands. So there was like 10 of us, and the company hired 300 of the workers. They paid them overtime for being out there. And I mean, it was like, start a fight, see if you can, and it was intimidation. It was like, and the thing was, I felt it's such an irony, because it was this huge benefit for Formosa, and it was every politician. I think there were 500 elected officials wearing gowns and furs and Cadillacs. They were given this big benefit for YC Wong. I was on one side, and all these workers were on the other, and it was like, they're being exposed, they're being kicked out, and here between us, ringing in all of this political agenda, the jewels, the wealth. And I was like, that is such a sad thing that they have put us in opposition there. And that was their agenda, is to put this opposition, for us to fight, for us to clash. And what I ended up doing is I aligned with them. And the workers became my best source of information. When things happen, it was the workers that called me. And if I ever have one message, and it's really not so much I tell them to do zero discharge, I tell them one person can make a difference. And I am probably the most unlikely person, because I didn't have the leadership ability, I didn't have the speaking, I didn't have the education, but the one thing I did have was my passion, and that's all that matters. And even Gandhi said it's a myth to believe that you got to have the people and that you got to have money. is because you don't need, in the beginning, you don't need none of that. All you have to do is have a vision, have an intent, and just go right for it. And it's like you step out into empty space and something is there where your foot will reach solid ground, and it's visionary. To me, it's visionary. It has something to do about hope and about integrity, and it's about your path. It's about your life, and it's, this old thing, as above so below. It's like there's nothing separate. There's no division in that philosophy, and anybody can do what I did. And I always encourage them is to step out, take a risk, and it will change your life like you cannot imagine.
See, don't mess with Texas, Exxon and Mobil. Don't mess with Texas, Freeport, McMoran. Don't mess with Texas, Formosa Plastic. Don't mess with Texas, water, air, and land. Don't mess with Texas, endangered species. Houston and the horny toad here before you. Laugh and snicker at these lowly critters. Cave-dwelling invertebrates have more backbone than you. Looking at the litter on the side of the road. Yeah, people should be busted for the trash they unload. Looking at the bigger picture in the corporate acts and how they get permitted makes me blow my stack. Don't mess with Texas, state legislature. Good old boy lobby, revolving bureaucrats. Don't mess with Texas, greenwashing admin. Your advertisements make me cry unless I laugh. Don't mess with Texas, it's quite the message. I think it's great, I hope we clean up the roads. The bigger message, the bigger messes. The bigger message also needs to be told. Looking at the litter on the side of the road. Some people should be busted for the trash they unload. Looking at the bigger picture and the grandfather acts and how they get permitted with a fine and a slap. Don't mess with Texas, Exxon and Mobil. Don't mess with Texas, Freeport and McMoran. Don't mess with Texas, clear-cutting loggers. Don't mess with Texas, water, air, and land. Don't mess with Texas.